All right, good morning and welcome to our May speaker series with Dr. Amrisha Vaish. Dr. Vaish is the Pamela Feiner Edmonds and Franklin S. Edmonds Jr. Discovery Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of Virginia. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology from UVA and Chicago, respectively, and a PhD in psychology from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the Free University Berlin. Dr. Vaish's research focuses on the emergence of the moral emotions, thoughts, and behaviors that make children successful cooperators. This includes the emergence of social emotions, such as sympathy, guilt, and forgiveness, of moral evaluations of one's own and others' actions, and of moral behaviors, such as helping and sharing, and the enforcement of moral norms. Dr. Vaish has already won several awards for her work, including the Rising Star Award and the Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions, both from the Association for Psychological Science. Her work has been featured in leading journals such as Child Development, Developmental Psychology, and Psychological Bulletin. Our Character Virtue Development Department was fortunate enough to begin working with Dr. Vaish in 2015. And since that time, she has received 2 grants that explore different aspects of forgiveness in early childhood. In today's talk, she will share 3 studies that illuminate when forgiveness emerges and how displays of forgiveness serve cooperative functions. Dr. Vaish, I'll turn the virtual microphone over to you now to take us through these exciting studies. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. I'll begin by apologizing for having to reschedule my talk from 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you received the update for why I had to do that. I got the vaccine the day before I was scheduled to give the talk, and I just predicted that I would probably not be in a good state, and I wasn't. So it was good that I was able to reschedule it. I appreciate your flexibility with that. Okay, I will get started. In the moment, of course, I always have to think again about how it works. Here we go. Okay, can you all see my the slide? Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the work that your foundation has so generously funded and enabled me to do. It's on the emergence of forgiveness in early childhood. So I'll begin by saying that all of the 3 studies that I'll present today were sort of led or co-led by a postdoc in my lab, Janine Oostenbroek, who is an author on all 3 of the papers. And of course, the funding was provided by the Templeton Foundation, for which I'm extremely grateful. So let's begin just with a sort of bigger picture, which is that, of course, humans are intensely social beings. We all know this. We benefit greatly from living and cooperating in groups by exchanging goods and services, coordinating efforts to obtain food, defending ourselves against predators, helping one another with childcare, and so on. And so it's really, really critical that we safeguard these really vital cooperative relationships. And one of the fundamental requirements for doing so, for safeguarding cooperation, is that once a cooperative relationship is damaged, if a cooperative relationship is damaged by a transgression, then we must repair it, right? That's as simple as saying, in order to maintain cooperation, we must maintain cooperation. We must repair a broken or ruptured relationship in order to continue to be able to cooperate. One half of this repair is, in some sense, the display of remorse that goes from the transgressor to the victim. Right. And so some kind of remorse that's displayed from one to the other. The other half, though, of this process is the forgiveness that flows from the victim to the transgressor. Right. And so both of these are kind of critical in one form or another. Right. And they can take many different forms, but in some form, these are really important for this repair to take place and for the cooperation to then be able to continue. And though researchers have been examining the early development and the expressions and the behavioral manifestations of remorse for quite some time now, it's really quite recently that we've begun to turn our attention to this second part of this process, the forgiveness, to the early emergence of this process. So what is forgiveness? It has a lot of definitions. I'm going to take to adopt a sort of an what's called emotional forgiveness definition, which is that forgiveness involves replacing negative emotions about the transgressor with positive other-oriented emotions. And forgiveness essentially restores the victim's positive feelings towards the transgressor and thereby allows the transgressor to re-enter these mutually beneficial relationships. And as such, forgiveness is really key to repairing our ruptured relationships. One of the key ways in which forgiveness is elicited, as I've sort of already alluded to, is by the expression of remorse, right? So prior work has theorized and also provided quite a lot of evidence that forgiveness is most strongly elicited by a transgressor's display of remorse. And this is in part because remorse displays indicate that the transgressor is also suffering, which elicits sympathy and forgiveness from the victim and from bystanders. They display that the transgressor is punishing him or herself, which then reduces the kind of punishment that others mete out to the transgressor. And they indicate that the transgressor is aware of the norms that they have broken and are in fact committed to those norms, are not the kind of person that generally breaks those norms, okay? And the lack of remorse displays actually convey the opposite piece of information, right? So when someone does not show any guilt or remorse for what they've done, they communicate the opposite pieces of information. And so it follows then, the prediction follows that remorseful transgressors should elicit more forgiveness, affiliation, and cooperation than unremorseful transgressors. And indeed, adults are sensitive to these functions of displaying remorse. There's a lot of work showing that we respond positively to displays of remorse by transgressors. And as observers, children do respond positively to remorse as well. There's quite a lot of work that has shown this. So for instance, by age 5 years of age, by age 5 years, children respond positively to transgressors who show remorse. By age 4 years, children respond positively to transgressors who explicitly apologize. So by age 4 years, children aren't quite robust enough to respond to remorse displays that don't include an explicit apology, like saying sorry, but they do respond positively to transgressors who explicitly apologize. So by about 4 to 5 years of age, children do begin to respond positively to transgressors' displays of guilt or remorse in the ways that adults do as well. In all of this prior work with children, though, children were the bystanders. They observed third-party transgressions or heard stories about third-party transgressions, and then were told that the transgressors showed remorse or didn't show remorse. But of course, to really kind of repair one's ruptured or broken relationships, the most important source of forgiveness is the victim, him or herself. Right? That is the principal relationship that's been ruptured. And so that's the place where forgiveness really needs to take place, right? So forgiveness has to really come from the victim. That's the key relationship that where forgiveness must take place. And so a question really that has remained open is whether children also forgive remorseful transgressors when they are themselves the victims, okay? So this is, of course, also especially important because unlike the case where children simply observe transgressions in third-party scenarios, here, right, when they are themselves harmed, and so they presumably have a much more negative response as the victim of the transgression, they may find it that much harder to overcome those negative emotions, those negative feelings, and forgive. And so it's possible that it's not until later that children begin to show the ability to forgive when they are themselves the victims. And so we wanted to examine these questions in some work that we've been doing in my lab as part of this grant. So in this first study that I'll talk about, we tested 4 and 5-year-old children based on this prior work that I've just talked about, showing that this is the age at which children begin to respond positively to remorse and apologies. So, except here, the children were themselves the victims. This was all approved by our ethics board, and it was all pretty minor. But it is important to find sort of ethical but meaningful ways to place children in these positions if we are to examine these questions. And so that's what we did here. So first, the child and two experimenters kind of sat around a table, and they all drew a picture. And we set it up as a little bit of a competition. We said whoever draws the best picture wins, so that it's sort of, there's a little more, it's a little more meaningful. And then once everyone had finished drawing their pictures, the two experimenters picked up each other's pictures and sort of admired them. And then they both took the child's picture to admire it and, sort of said, oh, what a lovely picture you've drawn, and so forth. And then in returning it to the child, they accidentally tore it. So they kind of both pulled in towards each other, towards themselves, and that ripped the picture apart. They then placed the picture on the table, and now one of the transgressors showed remorse. So she said, oh no, I've torn your picture. I didn't mean to do that. It's my fault. And so sort of facially and verbally expressed remorse. She did not explicitly apologize because, again, we wanted to kind of tease apart, the kind of robust response to remorse that doesn't rely on these scripted kind of conventional terms like sorry. And so she didn't say sorry, but she expressed remorse. The other transgressor was neutral. So she said, oh, I've torn your picture. Oh, well. Okay. And so now, after they had both done that, they both left the room. We had a third experimenter. This is Janine, the postdoc, who's sort of co-leading this work with me. She was the moderator in all of this. She hadn't been involved thus far, but she came now. She asked these two experimenters, the transgressors, to leave. And she then sat at the table and she asked the child several questions. And so this is where we're kind of measuring how the child responds to these two experimenters, to the two transgressors. So she asked the child 4 test questions. Whom are you more upset with? She named them. So she didn't say the remorseful one or the unremorseful one, but of course one had been remorseful and one had not. Whom do you like more? If you fell over, who would help you? And if you drew another picture, who do you think would tear it again? So kind of who do you expect to transgress again in the future? So we asked these 4 questions. Note that 2 of these, for 2 of these, the predicted response is the remorseful transgressor. So the positive questions, right? If you fell over, who would help you? And also, whom do you like more? And for questions 1 and 4, the predicted response is the unremorseful one. And so we wanted to make sure that children can respond in sort of both ways. And then we asked, Janine asked children to distribute 3 flowers, kind of a distribution of resources. Whom do they want to cooperate more with? So she asked them to distribute 3 flowers between the 2 transgressors. And of course, because it's 3, they'll be forced to give an uneven number to one of them, right? So here's what we found. So the green bars here are the data from the 5-year-olds, and the red bars are the data from the 4-year-olds. So we found that the 5-year-olds, and this is the proportion of children who respond as predicted. So respond, saying that they like the remorseful transgressor more and expect her to help them in the future, and are more upset with the unremorseful transgressor and expect her to transgress in the future again. So this is the proportion of children who responded as in those predicted ways. And you can see that across the board, the 5-year-olds are very robustly showing us that they are responding much more positively to the transgressor who showed remorse, as opposed to the one who didn't. And the 4-year-olds are the red bars, and you can see that they are sort of at chance. That is to say, they don't show a systematic response in either direction for any of the questions, and also not on the distribution of resources. And an advantage of this distribution task that we have at the end is that it's nonverbal, right? So if a problem that children are having, especially the younger ones, is that they just don't have the kind of verbal capacities to respond and to sort of, perhaps understand the kinds of questions that we're asking them, then perhaps on this behavioral task where they only have to distribute these flowers, they might show us that they have a preference, but they don't here. Note as well that this is, I didn't show you the graphs from the prior studies in which children were observers, but this is pretty much that pattern. We see the exact pattern here when children are themselves the victims as when children were the observers, which is that 5-year-olds are responding positively to remorse and 4-year-olds are not. Here again, we were, as in the case when children are were the observers in the prior work, we wanted to ask here as well, is the problem that they are just having a hard time with the procedure, right? Is it that they can't, that they're simply not, it's too much going on. They can't process all of these pieces of information, and that's why they're kind of falling flat here, right? So, or is it the case that it's really this kind of more complex display of remorse that they're not yet being able to respond to? And so we conducted a further study with a new group of 4-year-olds where we had the identical procedure. Everything was exactly the same, except now the remorseful transgressor also apologized. So she said, oh, I've torn your picture. I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry. I apologize. So she used these conventional kind of socialized, learned phrases that 4-year-olds are definitely very aware of. And now we found that the 4-year-olds, this is the blue bars now, in the case in which they heard an explicit apology, they show a really robust response now. They are responding a lot more positively to the apologetic transgressor than to the non-apologetic one. They look indeed very much like the 5-year-olds from before, and are better than the 4-year-olds in the in the first case in which there was no explicit apology. So here again, we're seeing that 4-year-olds are sensitive to the displays, but they need a little bit more. They need these more learned, socialized kinds of responses, and then they do differentiate between transgressors who show this kind of commitment to them, this norm following, this awareness that they have caused harm and so forth, but they need a little bit more scaffolding to get there. Okay, so we see here from this first study that between 4 to 5 years of age, children do develop the capacity to forgive remorseful transgressors. So not only when they're the observers and are kind of watching in a kind of cold, judgment state, but really when they have themselves been affected as well, they clearly are responding to a transgressor who shows them her commitment, who shows them that she didn't mean to cause harm and will not cause harm in the future. And so forgiveness seems to begin to serve to repair ruptured relationships already by the preschool years. Of course, it may not be wise to forgive all transgressors equally. I mean, we've already seen that children don't forgive all transgressors equally. They forgive a remorseful one more than an unremorseful one. But even when everyone is remorseful, it may be wise to be more differentiating. In particular, forgiveness may most usefully serve its functions when it's selectively directed towards reliable and trustworthy partners. So, by identifying who is reliable and trustworthy in whatever way one can, we maximize our future cooperation and we minimize the risk of exploitation. That is to say that selectivity in our forgiveness, selectively forgiving those that we think are reliable, trustworthy partners, that ensures that we kind of maximize the chances of successful future cooperation because we are choosing to forgive and to continue to cooperate with people that are trustworthy and reliable, while protecting ourselves from the risks that are associated with continuing relationships that are with uncooperative individuals. And so we may predict then that forgiveness should, from the beginning, or certainly from early on perhaps, be selectively directed towards reliable and trustworthy cooperative partners and away from unreliable and untrustworthy partners. Now, this is in line with something that's known as the valuable relationship hypothesis, which states that forgiveness evolved. This takes a sort of evolutionary perspective on forgiveness and says that the capacity to forgive evolved and is especially evident in valuable and mutually beneficial relationships. Okay, so theorists propose that close and committed relationship partners should more readily forgive each other because forgiveness is really an effective means of achieving the victim's primary goal, which is to remain in this relationship. Okay, so indeed, among adults, relationship closeness and commitment are positively related with forgiveness. We do tend to forgive those with whom we have established close relationships more than towards strangers, for instance. But there isn't actually any experimental work to examine this, not with adults and not with children. It's all thus far been correlational work. And there's certainly no developmental work on this either. And so in this next study, we set out to examine this question: do children selectively forgive partners that they believe to be reliable and trustworthy? So the way in which we operationalize, the way in which we sort of conceptualize reliable and trustworthy partners here is by thinking about group members. So one quick and reliable way we reasoned, one quick and reliable way to identify valued partners is group membership. So there's an extensive literature on group biases that some of you may be familiar with that demonstrates that we people in general, adults and children, prefer and trust and help, and in numerous other ways are biased towards our own group members than towards out-group members. Okay, and this in-group preference actually emerges by 5 years of age, approximately, but not earlier. So it's really around 5 that children begin to reliably show a preference for their in-group members in various ways. And in fact, this is even true for novel groups. So by age 5, group membership exerts a strong influence over children's cognition and behavior, even when the groups are novel. That is to say, they are not established existing groups in the real world, but they're based on arbitrary cues like color. So you just assign children to a new group when they come into the lab and say, you're in the green group or you're in the yellow group. And children then begin to, by 5 years of age, begin to show a bias towards other people in their yellow group, even though, right, the group has no meaning at all. They have no knowledge or pre-existing notions about what the group means, just by virtue of being in the group, that they begin to display a bias and a preference towards their in-group. Okay, so based on all of this, we then decided to think about reliable and trustworthy partners in terms of group members. So the question then became, do children forgive their in-group members, right, people who they presumably already have a preference for and think of as reliable and trustworthy, more than their out-group members? And so to test this idea, we tested a group of 5-year-old children, which is, as I said, when group bias begins to emerge. Excuse me. So we assigned children to novel groups when they came into the lab. So just, by picking a token from a little bag, are you in the green group? Are you in the yellow group? This is a method that's been used in lots of prior work on group cognition in children. So children were assigned to one group, and then 2 experimenters came in. One of them was in the child's group and one of them was in an out group. And so we did various tasks to get children sort of accustomed to this idea that they are in one group and this other person is in this other group, and so forth. And once children were sort of clearly displayed, an understanding of that, now we had the same transgression as before. So they all drew a picture. The 2 experimenters picked up the child's picture and accidentally tore it. And then importantly, now both showed remorse. Okay, so both showed that they clearly felt bad about what they had done, and they both sort of showed this cooperative intent towards the child, because what we wanted to see is when both individuals are showing the same kind of cooperative intent and the same kind of commitment and remorse to the child, does the child nonetheless selectively forgive the person that they identify more with, the in-group member? So after we had done this procedure, we had the same kind of procedure as before, where the moderator now asked the child some questions. We had the same kind of 4 forced choice questions that we had before. We also asked 2 additional questions about each transgressor separately in order to move away from this forced choice kind of scenario, just to get a little more data. I'm going to focus just on the forced choice question responses, but I'm happy to talk about the other ones later as well. And then we had the same kind of distribution of resources with the 3 flowers. So what we found here is that these children at age 5 showed a clear selectivity in that they significantly preferred the in-group member and evaluated the out-group member more negatively. So here now you're seeing the percent of children who chose the in-group. So this is not those who responded as predicted, but now the percent of children who chose the in-group. And you can see that, children are more upset with the out group. That is to say, they did not say in group in this case, they said out group. Most of them said out group. The majority of children liked their in-group member more. They thought that the in-group member would help more, and they thought that the out-group member would be more likely to push them off a swing later, so would be more likely to transgress later. And similarly, with the distribution of resources, they gave more resources to the in-group member. So here we're seeing the predicted effect that children are directing forgiveness selectively towards their in-group member, even though both the in-group member and the out-group member showed remorse. So they are showing this kind of bias in their forgiveness as well. This is really the first experimental evidence of this kind of selective forgiveness by group membership. But of course, a really critical question arises here that you've probably picked up on, which is, do children just always preferentially, forgive in-group transgressors? Perhaps they just always like, the bias that they already have towards in-group members is what's coming through here. It's not really forgiveness. And if it is, perhaps it's just regardless of what the in-group member does, they should always forgive the in-group member, right? Like that bias should come through regardless of what the in-group member does, just because there's such a strong bias at this age already to, a preference for the in-group member. So we asked then in a second study here, what if the in-group transgressor demonstrates uncooperativeness, such as by being unremorseful? So is it just always a strong preference for the in-group member, regardless of what she does? Or is it the case that if she shows the child, actually, I don't care about you, I don't have much cooperative intent towards you, I don't much care to make amends with you, then can the child actually pull away and preferentially forgive the out-group member, which would be kind of flipping this really prevalent in-group bias around. So the question is, can children actually show the opposite effect if the in-group member is in-group transgressor is unremorseful? So with a new group of 5-year-old children here, we had the identical setup, same sort of group assignment, but now the in-group member was unremorseful and the out-group member was still remorseful. So now we're pitting group membership with the remorse, and we're seeing which kind of wins out. Okay, and so we had the same test questions and the same distribution of resources task, and I want to show you here the results now from the 5-year-olds, and you may remember, if you remember what the pattern was for the other ones, you can see that this is exactly flipped. And in fact, if you compare the two studies, you can see that this is exactly flipped. So when the in-group member is, maybe I'll go back. Does it let me go back? Yeah, here we go. So they're much more upset with the in-group member. This is again the percentage of children who chose the in-group member. They're much more upset with the in-group member who was unremorseful. They like the out-group member more. They think the out-group member would help them more, and they think the in-group member would be more likely to push them off a swing in the future. Okay, so would be more likely to transgress, and they're distributing far more resources to the out-group member. And so this is that direct comparison, and you can see that on all measures children are really flipping and really sort of being almost really responding aversively to the lack of remorse from the in-group member. Okay, I want to show you one additional cool finding from one of the other questions that we asked children. So we had one final question that we asked children at the end, which was whether they thought their in-group member should remain in their group. Do you want your in-group member to stay in your group? And I want to show you the difference here across studies. The green bar is the first study where the in-group member was remorseful, and 95% of children said, yes, she should stay in my group. When she was unremorseful, only 40% of children said that, yes, she should stay in my group. 60% of children wanted her to leave their group. So they, were really responding negatively to her and actually wanted to, in some sense, distance themselves from this individual who clearly had not done, quote unquote, the right thing, at least towards them. Okay. So 5-year-olds seem to really selectively forgive reliable, trustworthy partners, in this case, group members. I know that I'm using a pretty general term there here. It's about group membership. So they rely on this heuristic of group membership, right? So when all other things being equal, they do show a preference to forgive the in-group member. However, when more immediate in some sense, more diagnostic cues about the individual are available about that individual's cooperativeness, then they rely on those a lot more than they do on just the heuristic of group membership. So yes, these heuristics are useful. They certainly show this selectivity in their forgiveness, but they are nonetheless more sensitive to the kind of immediate cues about the individual's remorse, individual's cooperative commitment, which I think is kind of a really nice, hopeful message from these data, which is that group membership matters, but in some sense, the individual's actions matter a lot more. And perhaps we can sort of build on that to overcome some of these biases that we see otherwise. Okay, and then finally, relatively briefly, I'll talk to you about the third study that was part of this package, which is on the display of forgiveness. So we reasoned here that if forgiveness serves these really vital cooperative functions, and in fact, if forgiveness has evolved in this way to serve these really vital cooperative functions, then perhaps the displays of forgiveness, the victim's display of forgiveness, also serves as a cue of cooperativeness. If it's been so important to, within reason, quote unquote, forgive transgressors, then the act of forgiveness itself may be a cue that I am the kind of person who is willing to make to repair relationships, to allow relationships to be repaired, to allow transgressors to re-enter these mutually sort of beneficial relationships with me. And so we reason then that victims who forgive may be seen as better cooperative partners. Okay, so this question, we believe, hasn't really been asked before at all, even with adults. And yet, in the same way that adults and children, we know that adults and children respond positively to displays of remorse and guilt, because guilt displays convey cooperative intent, we think it's possible that forgiveness does something similar as well. And so the question we asked here was, do we, even as children, value victims who forgive more than victims who don't forgive? I want to preface this work by saying it's, when to forgive, when not to forgive. These are really, really complex questions, and none of what I'm saying should be interpreted as suggesting that forgiveness is always the right response and is always the right solution. I think there's empirical, theoretical, philosophical discussions to be had about really legitimate concerns about when forgiveness is reasonable and when it isn't. And so I think that's a much broader question. But this is sort of in the most basic kind of scenarios, in these small accidental kinds of scenarios that we're dealing with. We can ask this question of, assuming, given that forgiveness seems like the right response, after remorse has been displayed and so forth, all the right things have been done, then do we value victims who forgive more than victims who don't forgive? So this was a pre-registered study with 4 and 5-year-olds. So here, what we did is we didn't have children themselves be part of the interactions. We just showed children the videos about, so the children were third-party observers here for a couple of different reasons that I'm happy to get into. So here, children essentially watched 2 videos on sort of 2 separate laptops, and on one of the laptops they watched a forgiving scenario. So they watched an individual. So this person had created this nice, lovely clay bird that she was very proud of. This person picks it up and looks at it, and then she's the other way around. She's made this lovely clay bird. This person is then going to break it, and then she is going to show remorse. And this person is then going to say, I'm very upset with you. And then after a moment say, I've thought about it some more. I'm not upset with you anymore. So we didn't use the word forgiveness, both because children may not understand it, or if they do, there may be all sorts of loaded things that they've learned about it. And so we kind of took that part out and we said, I'm not upset with you anymore. So she was a forgiving individual in this case. And in the other one, she had drawn this lovely picture and this person tore it. And now again, she showed remorse other way around. I got confused again. She had drawn the picture, she tore it and showed remorse. I'm sorry. And now she was not forgiving. So she said, I'm really upset with you. And then a moment later, she said, I've thought about it some more. I'm still really upset with you. Okay. So we it wasn't super negative, but we kind of pulled out this aspect of I'm upset with you versus I'm not upset with you anymore. So one was a forgiving individual, a forgiving victim, and the other was an unforgiving victim. And now same thing, we asked children various questions about the forgiving victim versus the unforgiving victim. So we found that by 5 years of age, and less robustly, even by 4 years, children preferred and positively evaluated and distributed more resources to victims who forgave. So the green bars are the 5-year-olds, and you can see here that across the board, they're showing us really strongly that they think the victim who forgave was more, that's the person they liked more. They thought that that's the person they wanted to be friends with. They thought that the victim and the transgressor would have a better relationship if the victim forgave, and so forth. So they were able to make all sorts of really important inferences about the relationship between the transgressor and victim, and also about their own reactions to the victim based on whether she forgave or not. The 4-year-olds were a chance on the questions, but in their distribution, they also showed us here. So this is that behavioral measure. They showed us that they did tap into this to some degree. They did give more resources to the forgiving victim. And so it looks then, this is the first evidence that displaying forgiveness itself seems to elicit cooperation from fairly early in development, that the display of forgiveness itself may be a cue to our cooperative intent and to our ability to repair and to continue cooperation, which may itself serve as a cue for future cooperation. Okay, so to conclude then, to live in and to benefit from social living, I argued at the start, we must repair our broken social relationships when there are ruptures, when there are transgressions. And forgiveness is really key to this kind of repair. It enables this kind of repair. And we find that from really quite early in development, by the preschool years, forgiveness enables such repair from early ages. And it is the case now that other labs have been replicating and extending this work as well, and finding very similar results as well. And in fact, even cross-culturally, finding that it's around 4, 5, 6 years that children begin to respond positively to displays of remorse and to really sort of value that after transgressions. We also see that this is a flexible capacity. So we don't forgive all remorseful transgressors equally. From an early age, we maximize future cooperation and minimize the risk of exploitation by flexibly forgiving those that we think will be more reliable and trustworthy partners, whatever that might look like in a particular situation. And also forgiveness displays convey key information and therefore confer cooperative benefits on the forgiver herself. And so in all of these ways and more, forgiveness helps to sustain and to promote cooperation from early in development. I have just 2 quick slides on current directions and a little bit of future work. Sarah, I didn't share these with you because I added them later on because I did want to sort of talk a little bit about what's coming. So with a new grant, also by the Templeton Foundation, we are now going to start exploring the boundaries of this early forgiveness. So, all of our scenarios that I've talked about now, all are sort of these very particular, specific kinds of very basic accidental minor transgressions. And that's for important ethical reasons, of course, but it is important to start asking, what are the boundaries of this? When do children not forgive someone, even if they are remorseful, for instance, right? Do children take into account other aspects of transgressions? Does the seriousness of a transgression matter? And so to begin this line of questioning, we're going to be focusing on the transgressor's intentions. So do children take into account whether a transgressor intentionally caused harm versus accidentally? Everything we've done so far has been examining accidental transgressions, but it is important to ask, what happens if someone caused you harm intentionally? Well, then a simple display of remorse, which is supposedly indicates I didn't really mean to do that, doesn't hold anymore, because you did mean to do that. You did mean to cause harm. So do we even from an early age, withhold forgiveness in those kinds of cases. Similarly, with repeat transgressions. So if someone on occasion causes me harm and it's accidental, that's one thing. But if someone repeatedly harms me in the same ways, over and over again, well, that tells me this person, perhaps even apologizes, but is not really very concerned about my welfare because they're not becoming more careful over time or really taking into account my needs over time. And so do children have these kinds of boundaries in their forgiveness? And then as a second step, if they do, can those boundaries be stretched? So what does it take to forgive intentional or repeat transgressors? What do transgressors have to do? What does the situation demand of them, such that we can then engage in forgiveness? Because ultimately, forgiveness is the way back to that mutually beneficial cooperative relationship. But some transgressions require different kinds of solutions, different kinds of repair. And so what does that look like? And how do we get children to get there after more egregious transgressions, for instance? More generally, my other areas of research that we're doing in my lab, focus on other aspects of, character virtues, really. So early gratitude, the development of fairness, the impact of inequality, experiencing inequality on children's social behaviors. We have some new work on environmental morality, so children's reasoning about environmental harm, for instance. And then sort of just a longer term outlook that I just wanted to sort of, the dream here is something like my colleagues here at UVA and I have been talking about establishing something like the Center for the Flourishing Child. So here it would, the idea would be to conduct research on basically raising caring, curious, and cooperative children. And some of the key features of a center like this would be a focus on flourishing. So really expansively researching positive social, cognitive, and moral development from birth to age 5 years. So really in early development. And I think this would really fill a sort of critically important gap, as currently, as far as we know, no initiative really anywhere answering, focusing on well-being and flourishing in early childhood, where we know that so much, all of the critical stuff happens, or much of the critical stuff. There would also be a real focus on the mind and brain, and so we'd want to use portable, child-friendly behavioral, physiological neuroscience methods and conduct cross-sectional and large-scale longitudinal work to study the whole child, and to really begin to be able to predict developmental outcomes. And there would be a focus on community engagement and diversity. So we would really seek to actively work to include racially, ethnically, socioeconomically diverse populations from our community and other communities, including with something like a mobile lab. So you can imagine a dedicated kind of van, with research equipment that goes out into the community and to really start to make the whole project a little bit more coherent, larger and wider. And I think this kind of thing would really be at the forefront of sort of discovery and, positive early child development, something that doesn't currently exist. And so that's the kind of long-term dream that all of this is working towards. Okay, and so with that, I just want to thank you so much for the invitation, and for listening so patiently to my talk.
Wonderful, thank you. We are going to shift to the Q&A portion of the talk. So for our team members.
Would you like me to stop sharing or stay
Sure,
on?
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that might help. And then we can see some of our team members. For our team members, please feel free, as we have done in the past, to put your questions in the chat bar. I'm going to take the opportunity, though, to ask the first question. I was really struck by the role that the cue of "I'm sorry" played for those 4-year-olds and how strong that was. And you alluded to this just a bit at the end of your talk, but I was curious about your predictions for cross-cultural findings.
Yeah.
And it is very common in preschools in the US, and I think just among parenting guides, right? You reinforce the "I'm sorry" language. How much of either that tool or just the general behavior would you expect cross-culturally?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know so little actually at the moment about precisely this question about how much are these polite, it's politeness phrases, but I personally think they're more than that, but let's call them politeness phrases for now, these sort of conventional phrases. How much are they stressed? What do they look like in other places? We know very, very little about that. It's certainly the case that the weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures, this is a theme, right? That parents say thank you, say please, say sorry, and so forth. And it's not clear that other places do that. In fact, I think in the gratitude work that I've been looking at a little bit, it looks like in India, certainly in some parts of India, it just isn't. One doesn't express gratitude verbally. You don't say thank you. You do it through actions, and perhaps later down the line, right? But it's not something that you express. And so, and I can very much imagine that that's the case with something like sorry as well. And so I think you're exactly right, Sarah, that that is probably that's probably a kind of byproduct of this specific cultural setting, and we probably wouldn't see the same kind of stark difference between 4 and 5 in other places. And I think that's probably more generally true even of the remorse displays. So I think the sorry, the conventionalized phrases is one aspect, but I think even these kinds of displays may not, I don't know if they're encouraged and socialized in the same strong ways in other places as they are certainly in the US and in Western Europe. So yeah, I don't know. The cross-cultural work that does exist has actually used sorry. So this is McAuliffe and colleagues' work that they've been recently presenting. Maybe I don't think it's published yet, the cross-cultural aspect, but yeah, so they have just gone with a straight apology and they see very similar effects. But that's not to say it's universal, right? And so we don't know enough about it yet. Yeah.
I'm so curious to see that work.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. We have a comment from one of our colleagues that said it might be a little easier to explain himself than to write out. So Kevin, do you want to jump in and ask?
Thank you for the opportunity. And that was a great talk. Really interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question that maybe is a little unfair. Because it's not strictly speaking about your research, but is about your future directions. So as you were talking, I was thinking about Corrie ten Boom, you might know, right? Whose family was taken into Ravensbrück, and she was the only one that emerged.
Oh, wait, no, sorry, I don't know this. What is this?
So Corrie ten Boom is a international speaker. Her experience was that she is a Jew. She and her family were taken in under Nazi occupation to Ravensbrück, and they all perished except for her. And she spoke very broadly since then, since the 50s really, about the value of forgiveness. During one of her talks, one of the old guards from the concentration camp came forward and apologized to her and asked her forgiveness. And she, despite all these conversations around forgiveness, felt she could not forgive the person. And she's spoken broadly about the value of the will and choosing to forgive.
Yeah.
And then she had the experience that she's a religious person. She felt this beyond her will, this desire to forgive the person. And so for her, it wasn't something of the will. Now that person is part of the out group. She'd never see that person again. And that person represents people that were not actually the people who actually did all these atrocities to her and her family. So I understand this is different than the work that you're doing in 4 and 5-year-olds, but I wonder if that kind of forgiveness that does not seem to be a willful one is a different kind of forgiveness than the kind of cost benefit analysis that these kids are doing. And if you'd have any comment on more broadly different types of forgiveness and well, actually, let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's not unfair. I mean, it's I can't answer it with data, but it's not unfair, it's not an unfair question at all. I fully yeah, that's great. And I've been thinking a lot about these really I guess in the context of these sort of more egregious transgressions and these much more severe situations in which forgiveness seems out of reach, right? I mean, so there are stories in the media regularly about parents of a child who was murdered, for instance, or, you know, something like that, eventually then coming to forgive the murderer and actually speaking up for them in court and things like this, and coming to getting to know them and becoming friends with them and things like this. I mean, it's just really sort of remarkable stories. Yeah, and so there's certainly types of forgiveness. I think you're right. I with our work, obviously, we focus on these very sort of, you know, stereotypical, in some sense, prototypical, not stereotypical, prototypical kinds of scenarios and basic kinds of forgiveness. But yeah, but part of this is this emotional forgiveness is overcoming your negative feelings and replacing them with positive feelings. But like, what is the motivation for that? I think is partly what you're asking, right? So is it like, this is a better person for me to hang out with? This is a person I can trust more than this other person, this sort of cost benefit? Or is it just this, you just are overcome with a realization that you no longer hold those negative feelings, or you don't want to hold those negative feelings anymore? And for that latter kind, I don't know what the origins of that would be. I suspect there's a lot of finding peace and making peace with the situation first yourself, and then being able to see the other person with real empathy and with real, really be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and so forth. And these are such complex phenomena. And that, you know, for all of the cases in which that kind of forgiveness happens, there's a lot more cases, I imagine, where it doesn't, where the grudges hold. And one might say evolutionarily, in some sense, you know, and this is Mike McCullough's kind of, you know, the vengefulness also has a place in our evolution, right? I mean, it makes sense in some sense to hold those. But then there are ways to overcome even that. And in some sense, this boundaries part that I was talking about and stretching the boundaries is that, what does it take? And I guess you could extend the question beyond that. What does the transgressor have to do to what does the victim have to do? What does it take for the victim to get there? You know, and I think there is discussion, certainly with the adult work, on there's a lot of empathizing that has to happen, and a lot of coming to terms with the transgression yourself first, and being able to come to peace with it first yourself, and then being able to take the other's perspective and then really see them for what they are. I will say that I know I'm making this really long because I don't have a clear answer. I'm sort of thinking out loud here as I talk. I will say that part of what really intrigues me with these really more egregious, serious kinds of transgressions is the proposal that's out there, but it hasn't really been tested, and I want to get there eventually as well, is the idea that after an intentional transgression, for instance, after repeated egregious intentional transgressions of the kind that you're describing, what a transgressor has to do is not just say, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. It's not just, I didn't mean to do that thing. It's that I am a totally different person now. Like, it has to be a change. You see what I mean? So like, like the person has to say, not only did I not mean to do that thing, or not only will I, you know, I'll be more careful. It's that I am no longer the kind of person that could ever do that again. And I think if that is conveyed in some convincing way, I think the victim can empathize so much more then with that person now, right? And see the change. And I think that takes a lot of things. In part, it takes time. So after someone has just caused these terrible things to happen to someone, it would be really odd and non-compelling for them to come right after and say, oh, I would never do that again, right? I mean, it's just not compelling. It takes time for that kind of change to happen. And so I think there's a lot of complex factors there. But that's one that I wanna move towards eventually with kids in some sort of ethical fashion. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's try and squeeze in at least two more, because we have a very active group now.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more, and this might be tough, so it just might not be possible in the time allowed, but about when the transgression is passed down to the children, either by caretakers or the community, and the transgressor is a group of people. So, for example, post-conflict Northern Ireland. So when it's kind of embedded in the cultural environment, the impact of that, I imagine there might not be a lot of great research on it right now. But.
Yeah, certainly not with children, but we do have. So there is some work on like collective emotions more generally. So not collective forgiveness or collective vengefulness necessarily among children, but we do have some work on preschool, early school age children on collective guilt. So, or like accepting collective responsibility. So if the child's group member has caused someone harm, we see that by 5 years of age, children, we didn't, not necessarily signs of guilt. We didn't really test directly for, signs of guilt, but accepting responsibility. So children said, if their in-group member had caused someone harm, they said, if we asked them, should you repair it or should someone else repair it? They said, I should repair it. But if an out-group member had caused harm, they were less likely to say they themselves should repair it. So we do have evidence that already by 5 to 6 years of age, children are beginning to show this kind of collective feelings of social emotions like guilt. But the generational aspect is really interesting. There is some work on things like reparations, for instance, and I know in Australia there's been some sociological work on this with Indigenous populations about kind of what does it take for an entire country or an entire government to make up, to make up for or make amends for, transgressions from decades ago, generations ago. And part of actually going back to this prior point, part of what it takes is for the government or the individuals to acknowledge that that is no longer who they are. Like the values have changed and we will not do it again, and so it takes that kind of profession, professing to have forgiveness emerge, even across generations. But yeah, we don't know much about this with children. It is important to think about.
Yeah, lots more science to do. We have another colleague with a 5-year-old daughter who's grateful for the insightful talk. You explained that 5-year-olds prefer those that show more remorse more than they prefer those in their novel group. But what if the group is not novel, not just a random assignment, and they have a stronger connection with the group? For example, what if the 5-year-olds were divided into boys and girls? Is the preference for those who show remorse still likely to be stronger than the preference for those in your group?
Yeah, great question. There's advantages to using novel groups, which is all of the experimental control that you get, right? And none of the baggage, quote unquote, baggage from, prior life that they come in with. But yeah, we do lose the sort of the real world meaningfulness of them. So there is a little bit of work now that Yarrow Dunham and others have been doing, trying to see whether the effects that you see with minimal groups are similar as effects you might see with real world groups, and they basically see an overlap. So they see similar effects emerging for real world groups that they see for minimal groups, which is to say that the biases persist in both. The question I think is very apt, which is, can we reduce the biases in the same way as well for real world groups? And we don't know the answer to that. I suspect it would be harder. I suspect that if there are those existing emotional connections, it's going to be harder to get them to ignore that group membership. But so far as we know, the two, are quite, work quite similarly, but we don't know yet in terms of reducing the groups if it's the same. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to squeeze in one more.
Yeah.
Have you done any research on memory and forgiveness? I'm wondering how long children at different ages remember wrongs done to them and how that affects future wrongs and forgiveness.
Yeah, great question. Part of the challenge actually with all of the work that I've presented is we don't actually, this is a real limitation in my own work, I'm just going to say it, is we don't test how bad of a transgression children think it is. Like, how upset are they actually? And, you know, and so that's something that I'm going to work into the incoming work. I mean, do they even care about this thing? We made it so that they ought to care a little bit. It's their own thing, and it's a little competition, and they could win like a prize still, right? I mean, pictures get torn and things happen, and perhaps children don't actually even get very upset about it. As a parent of young children, I will say that kids, certainly by 4 to 5 years of age, keep things in mind and will remind me when I've forgotten things, and will remind me when I came too late for pickup, or whatever it is, right? And will hold it against me. And so much profuse apologies have to happen. And so, you know, I think they do remember, but whether they're holding it as a grudge such that they will then avoid that person and so forth, we don't actually know it. This is a limitation of the work that I have to improve on. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I wish we had you for another half hour, because we could fill it with questions, but we will continue to remain in touch and obviously watch your work unfold. It's fantastic. I love that we're breaking new ground in this area of the science of forgiveness in early childhood. So thank you for your work very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry that I went over, so we didn't have as much time as we might have wanted for questions, but feel free to reach out too if you want to chat some more. I'm happy to email and things. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Take care,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.